All right, fellow Voyagers, ready for another deep dive? This time, we're tackling Moana 2. I know, the first one was like, chef's kiss, right? But are the sequels ever as good?
Well, that's the million-dollar question these days, isn't it? Sequels gotta be more than just a rehash. Audiences want something new, something that, expands the world,
Totally. So we've got a whole stack of professional reviews here from places like IGN, The Independent, even the Indian Express, all weighing in on Moana 2, ready to see if it's worth setting sail.
Let's do it. Chart a course for the deep dive.
I love it. Okay, so quick recap. Moana 2 picks up 3 years after the first movie. Moana's like the wayfinding superstar now, respected by her whole island. But she's got this itch, this feeling that there's more out there, beyond the horizon. Oh, and we also meet her little sister, Samea, and she's pretty important to the story.
It's interesting how they've set up Moana's, her conflict. I mean, she already found herself in the first movie, right? So where do you go from there?
Right. It's not like she's got to discover who she is anymore.
Right. Exactly. So this need for connection, for something bigger than just her island, it's a smart way to send her off on a new adventure.
And that adventure kicks off when Moana stumbles on this evidence that Polynesian peoples used to be way more connected, like way back in the day. This leads her to search for the lost island of Motifetu. And get this, Motifetu was cursed by this god, Nalo, to keep people apart.
Oh, wow. A cursed island, huh?
Yep. But the reviews are kind of vague on why Nalo did that. Like, what's his motivation? Feels like the filmmakers are leaving some breadcrumbs, maybe setting something up for the future.
That's a good point. A good villain needs, understandable motivations, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious why the reviewers all picked up on that ambiguity around Nalo.
Yeah. Makes you think, was it intentional or just a plot hole? Time will tell, I guess.
Yeah.
But speaking of fan favorites, Maui is back.
Oh, I knew you were going to say that. Gotta love Maui. What's he up to this time?
Dwayne Johnson is back in the role, and reviewers are loving his performance, saying he brings that same humor, that same Maui charm, even when the story maybe isn't at its strongest.
See, that's what a charismatic actor can do, right? They can, elevate a script just by being themselves. Audiences love Maui, so having The Rock back is a big win for the movie, for sure.
Oh, and you are not going to believe this, but Maui starts the movie trapped inside a giant clam in its digestive system.
Wait, what?
I know, right? Rough start to the day. And inside the clam, he runs into this, well, I guess you'd call her a pseudo-villain, this character named Matangi. Reviewers say she has this awesome musical number, maybe some past connection with Maui, but then, poof, she's gone, vanishes super quick, which makes me think she'll be back for, Moana 3, Moana 4.
Oh, that's interesting. This whole setting things up for the future thing can be kind of risky, can't it? On the one hand, it keeps you guessing, leaves you wanting more, but on the other, it's did we even get a complete story in this movie?
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. So alongside Maui, we've got Moana's new crew for this adventure. There's Lodo, he's the inventor, always tinkering. Then there's Kele, kind of the grumpy farmer of the group. And finally, Moni, who's the ultimate Maui superfan. But here's the thing, a lot of the reviewers found him fun, but a little, underdeveloped, more like archetypes than fully fleshed out characters.
Yeah, that's tough. Sequels often struggle with that, right? Especially when they introduce a whole new cast. It's hard to give everyone enough depth in one movie.
For sure. But one thing the reviewers were raving about was the animation. Apparently, it's incredible, especially the water effects.
Oh, wow. The water in the first Moana was already stunning. I can't even imagine.
Right. They mentioned this one scene where Moana and her crew are battling this giant clam. The reviewers were blown away by how the animators captured the clam's shell, the translucency and how light refracts through the water, made it seem super otherworldly.
That sounds amazing. I'm already picturing it. You're right there in the ocean with them.
Okay, now brace yourself. Because this is the part that, makes me want to curl up in a ball. The music.
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yeah. Lin-Manuel Miranda, he wasn't involved this time.
Yeah.
And a lot of the critics are saying the new songs just don't hit the same way as the original. Remember How Far I'll Go? Chill.
Yeah. That song was magic. Pure magic. Miranda is such a talent. It's got to be tough to follow that,
Right. The reviewers were pretty disappointed, saying the new songs are, fine, but that they just don't have that same energy, that same emotional depth as the first movie's soundtrack. One reviewer even compared listening to the Moana 2 soundtrack to sailing on a ship with a hole in its hull. Brutal.
Ouch. That's harsh, but I can see where they're coming from. Sounds like the new songwriters, they tried their best, but that Miranda spark, it just wasn't there.
Yeah.
This could be a deal breaker for some fans, for sure. Okay, so get this. You know how some reviewers were saying the movie felt kind of episodic?
Yeah.
Like all over the place?
Yeah.
Well, apparently Moana 2 was originally going to be a Disney Plus series, like a whole show, not a movie. But then, somewhere along the way, they switched gears and made it a film.
Wait, seriously, I did not know that. So are you saying, like, it feels like they took a whole season of Moana and crammed it into 2 hours?
That's kind of what some reviewers are saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Like the plot jumps around too much and certain parts feel rushed or like incomplete. Some even said certain characters and plot lines would have worked way better in a longer format, with more space to breathe.
That makes sense. It's like trying to fit a whole ocean into a teacup. Some stuff's gonna get lost along the way. It's a shame though, because I bet those underdeveloped parts had potential.
Right. Like, take that Matangi character. Some reviewers think she could have been a way more interesting villain if they'd given her more screen time or, backstory.
Classic sequel bait, right? Give us a taste, then make us wait for the next one to get the full meal. But sometimes it works, it makes you eager for more, but sometimes it just backfires.
Totally. It all depends on whether the audience is already hooked on the world, on the characters.
Right.
If they are, then maybe they'll be willing to forgive a few underdeveloped parts, hoping that the next movie delivers.
I mean, after that ending in the first Moana, who wouldn't want to dive back into that world? The animation, the music, the characters, it was like peak Disney magic.
True. That first movie was huge. It resonated with people on a deep level, and the songs, oh man, those songs are still stuck in our heads all these years later. But that sets a high bar for any sequel.
Right. So the big question is, does Moana 2 recapture that magic? Or is it more like, hey, remember how much you loved the first one? Well, this one's all right.
Yeah. Based on these reviews, it sounds like the general consensus is more on the all right side. There's definitely stuff to enjoy, like the visuals and Dwayne Johnson's performance, but most critics agree it doesn't quite reach the heights of the original, especially when it comes to the music.
Yeah, that's the real bummer, isn't it? That Miranda magic is definitely missing.
It's tough to replace a talent like him. His ability to create those catchy melodies and write lyrics that actually mean something and fit the story so perfectly, it's special. And while the new songs might have their moments, they just don't reach that same level.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got incredible visuals, a mixed bag of characters, a plot that might feel a bit jumpy, and music that's, not quite as magical as the first one. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Honestly, it sounds like Moana 2 is going to be kind of divisive. Some people, those going in with more realistic expectations, those who just want to enjoy the spectacle and see what Moana and Maui are up to next, they might have a good time.
But those diehard fans of the first movie, the ones who still blast How Far I'll Go in the car, they might be left feeling, a little underwhelmed.
It's a tough call. Ultimately, whether or not someone's going to enjoy Moana 2, it comes down to personal preference and expectations.
And maybe how much they're willing to gamble on those sequel teases. Will those pay off later down the line?
Exactly. But hey, even with its flaws, Moana 2 does offer some interesting things, right? We see Moana growing as a character, and it hints at a bigger, more connected world out there, ripe for exploration in future movies.
So maybe there's hope for Moana 3.
Oh, there's always hope, especially with a world as rich and as full of possibilities as the Moana universe. Speaking of possibilities, did you read what the reviewers said about the ending? It seems like it's setting up future sequels, leaving a bunch of plot threads unresolved.
Ooh, I'm trying not to spoil anything for our listeners, but I'm dying to hear your take on this. What do you think about these open endings?
Well, I think it's important to ask, what's the intent behind these open endings? Are they meant to make the audience hungry for more, eager to see where the story goes next? Or do they feel like a cop-out, like a way to avoid giving a satisfying conclusion to this movie?
Right. Is it okay for a sequel to basically be setting the stage for future stories, or should it be able to, stand on its own 2 feet?
The reviewers had some pretty different opinions on that. Some felt the ending was way too open-ended, leaving them with more questions than answers. Others found it, intriguing. It made them curious about what might happen next.
So how do we make sense of these different viewpoints?
I think the thing to remember is that art is subjective, right? What one person finds satisfying, another might find frustrating.
True, but it does make you think, right? If a sequel is mostly focused on setting up future installments, is it really doing its job as a standalone film?
That's a good question. And it's something audiences should think about when they're deciding whether or not to see Moana 2. Is this a journey they want to take, knowing that the full picture might take a few more movies to become clear?
Because Let's be real. If the whole movie is just set up and no payoff, that's a huge letdown for fans who are hoping for a complete, satisfying story, right?
It's a gamble, for sure. But hey, sometimes those gambles pay off. Maybe Moana 3 will be the epic conclusion that ties everything together.
Or maybe it'll leave us hanging again, waiting for Moana 4.
Who knows? Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure. The Moana universe is huge and full of potential. I'm excited to see where this journey takes us.
Me too. I'm always up for an adventure, especially when it involves incredible animation, catchy music, and a strong female lead.
Even if that lead is still figuring out where she's headed next.
Exactly, because sometimes the journey is just as important as the destination.
And that's a lesson that Moana, in all her wayfinding glory, embodies perfectly.
Okay, so we've covered the plot, the characters, the music, the sequel setup, but there's one more thing we got to talk about before we wrap things up, and it's a bit of a sensitive topic.
Come on,
A lot of the reviewers mentioned this online discussion about the film's portrayal of Polynesian culture. Some people are praising it for being respectful and accurate, while others are raising concerns about, potential appropriation.
Yeah, that's a really important conversation, and one we need to approach carefully and respectfully.
Totally. And just to be clear with our listeners, we're not experts on Polynesian culture. Our goal here is just to present the different perspectives we found in the reviews and encourage people to think critically about these issues.
Exactly. It's not our place to judge, but we can create a space for these voices to be heard and acknowledge that these are complex issues.
So what are some of the specific concerns that have been raised?
Well, some critics pointed out that the movie draws inspiration from a lot of different Polynesian cultures, which can sometimes lead to, a blending or oversimplification of distinct traditions. Others question the casting of the voice actors, arguing that more Polynesian actors should have been involved.
And then there's the issue of, commercialization, the concern that the movie's popularity might lead to Polynesian culture being exploited for profit.
It's important to be aware of the potential impact of a film like this, both the good and the bad.
So where do we go from here?
I think the most important thing is to keep talking about it, to listen to different perspectives, and to engage with these issues thoughtfully and respectfully.
And to recognize that representation matters. It's crucial for films like Moana to accurately and authentically portray the cultures they depict.
And to do so in a way that honors and respects those cultures, not exploits them.
All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the plot, the characters, the music, the sequel setup, and the cultural considerations surrounding Moana 2. Phew, this has been quite the deep dive.
It has, and I always enjoy these conversations, even when the topics are challenging and complex.
So, final verdict time. Should our listeners set sail for Moana 2?
That's a tough one. If they're hoping for the same magic as the first one, they might end up disappointed.
But if they're open to something different, maybe a movie that prioritizes the spectacle over the story, they might have fun.
Right. And if they're intrigued by those sequel teases, they might be willing to look past some of the flaws, excited to see what happens next.
Sounds like it's up to each individual viewer to decide then, but at least we've given them the information they need to make an informed choice.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Equipping our listeners with knowledge.
Well said. Okay, everyone, that's a wrap for today's deep dive into Moana 2. We hope you've enjoyed the journey.
And we encourage you to keep exploring these topics and forming your own opinions.
Because, as Moana taught us, sometimes you have to sail beyond the reef to discover who you truly are.
And sometimes you just gotta ride the wave and see where it takes you.
So we've talked about the good stuff, the not so good stuff, and all the complicated stuff about how Moana 2 portrays Polynesian culture. But before we set you loose to decide about watching this thing, there's one more layer we should think about.
Yeah, you're right. This gets to the heart of what makes a good sequel. Right? It's not just about doing the same thing again. It's about building on the original in a way that feels, meaningful.
Exactly. And that's where that whole episodic thing comes in. If Moana 2 is setting up a much bigger story, maybe even a whole Moana saga, how do we even judge it right now?
It's kind of like watching the first season of a show, before you know the whole story. Those episodes that feel like standalone adventures, they could be setting up something much bigger. Maybe those characters who feel kind of flat now, maybe they get their chance to shine later on.
So the question is Moana 2 a good chapter, even if it's not the whole story? That's a tough one to figure out.
It is. If we accept that this movie is mostly about laying the groundwork for more movies, then yeah, it might not have the same kind of ending as a movie that's meant to stand alone.
So we might walk away with more questions than answers.
Maybe. But isn't that part of the fun sometimes? The mystery, the anticipation, wondering what's going to happen next.
I can see that, especially if you're already hooked on the world, on the characters. A good cliffhanger always leaves you wanting more.
Exactly. And if Moana 2 does that, if it sparks that curiosity, that desire to see where the story goes, then it's done what any good franchise starter is supposed to do.
But what about those of us who aren't that patient? What if we just want a good, complete story now?
I get it. That's totally fair. It's a question viewers have to answer for themselves. Are they willing to go on this ride with Moana, knowing that the full picture might take a while to come into focus?
Or do they want their movies to have a nice, neat ending tied up with a bow?
It really comes down to personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer.
That's what makes these conversations so interesting, don't you think? We're not just arguing about whether Moana 2 is good or bad. We're talking about bigger things, like how stories are told, how sequels work, these whole movie franchises, and how we deal with these giant cinematic universes that just keep expanding.
Now that's a deep dive worth taking.
Absolutely. So for anyone out there still on the fence about Moana 2, here's the big question we want you to think about. Is it okay for a sequel to feel more like a stepping stone to something bigger? Or should every movie be able to stand on its own?
Think about those amazing visuals, all those mixed reviews, and how much you loved that first Moana. That's what we want you to ponder.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Moana 2. We hope you enjoyed the journey.
And we encourage you to keep exploring these topics, keep asking questions, keep diving deep.
Until next time, fellow voyagers.